They said he was seen with her by the river at night, and in a town like Red Hollow. That was enough to make a man guilty before sunrise. The wind carried dust low across Main Street, slipping through the gaps in wooden boards and settling into every quiet corner where men pretended not to listen and women pretended not to judge, but everyone did. Because out here stories moved faster than horses and stuck longer than truth ever could. And Ethan Cole felt it before he even stepped off his porch that morning. The way conversations dipped when he passed. The way eyes followed but never met his. The way silence gathered behind him. Like something alive, breathing slow and patient, waiting for him to turn around and face it. But he didn't. He just kept walking, boots pressing into the dry earth. Each step measured like a man who knew better than to rush when the ground beneath him was already shifting. 3 nights earlier, the river had been louder than usual, swollen from distant rain he hadn't seen but could hear in the current. A low steady pull that sounded like it knew secrets and didn't plan on sharing them. And he'd gone down there for the same reason he always did. To sit where no one asked questions and nothing expected answers. Just the water moving and the sky stretching wide above it. Stars scattered like someone careless with their hands. And that's when he saw her, standing, knee-deep in the slow bend where the current softened, her silhouette still as if the world had paused around her, long dark hair catching what little moonlight there was. And for a moment he thought she might vanish if he blinked, the way some things do when you're not meant to see them. But she didn't. She turned, slowly, like she already knew he was there, like she'd been waiting for the sound of his boots against stone. And when her eyes found his, there was no fear in them, none of that quick, startled look most folks carried when they saw a stranger alone at night. Just something steady, something that held its ground without needing to prove it. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice quiet but clear enough to carry across the water. Not a warning, not exactly, more like a statement of fact, the kind that didn't need arguing with. And Ethan could have turned then, could have tipped his hat and walked back up the bank, left it at that like a man with sense might do. But something in the way she stood there, unshaken, unhurried, made him stay, made him answer without thinking too hard about the cost of it. "River don't belong to me," he said, keeping his tone even, hands loose at his sides where she could see them, because he knew enough to understand that presence meant more than words out here. And she studied him for a long second, eyes moving not over his face but through him, as if she were measuring something deeper than what could be seen. And then she took a step closer, water shifting around her legs, the sound soft but deliberate. And that's when he noticed it, the small thing glinting at her throat, catching the light just enough to be seen and then disappear again, like it didn't want to be noticed by anyone who hadn't earned it. "Some things don't belong to anyone," she said, and there was something beneath those words, something he couldn't quite place but felt all the same, like the air before a storm you can't yet see. And before he could ask what she meant, before he could decide whether staying was worth whatever trouble might follow, the current shifted, just slightly, and something small broke free from where it had been resting against her collar, slipping into the water between them without a sound, and both of them saw it at the same time. The faint glimmer as it caught the moonlight once before the river took hold, and Ethan moved without thinking, stepping forward into the cold pull, boots sinking just enough to remind him the ground wasn't as steady as it looked, hand reaching down as the current tried to carry it past him. And when his fingers closed around it, there was a strange kind of weight to it, heavier than it should have been, like it carried more than just its shape. And when he straightened, water dripping from his sleeve, he saw something change in her expression for the first time. Not fear, not anger, but recognition, the kind that settles in slow and deep and doesn't leave once it's found its place. "You shouldn't have touched that," she said, softer now, and for the first time, there was something like concern in her voice. But it wasn't for herself, and Ethan glanced down at the small turquoise pendant resting in his palm, the stone wrapped in thin silver that seemed too deliberate to be just decoration, and he felt it then, not in his hand, but somewhere quieter, somewhere harder to explain, like a line had been crossed without him seeing where it began. And when he looked back up, she was watching him not as a stranger anymore, but as something else entirely, something that had already become part of a story neither of them had meant to start. By the time the sun climbed over the low ridge east of Red Hollow, the story had already taken on a life of its own, and Ethan Cole could hear it in the way boots slowed when he walked past the general store, in the way the barber paused mid-sentence with his razor held just a little too still, in the way even the horses tied along the post seemed to shift quieter than usual, as if the whole town had agreed without speaking that something had changed and no one quite knew what to call it yet. Only that it had something to do with him and the girl no one admitted to seeing, but everyone believed was real. He stepped into the saloon just after 9, not because he wanted a drink, but because routine mattered out here, and breaking it only gave people more reason to look at you sideways. And the air inside carried the usual mix of stale whiskey and old wood, but the voices dropped the moment the door closed behind him, not all at once, just enough to make the silence noticeable, like a breath being held across the room. Old man Hargrove leaned back in his chair near the window, hat tipped low, but his eyes followed Ethan in the reflection of the glass, and a younger man at the far table nudged his companion without trying too hard to hide it, their whispers cutting off as soon as Ethan's boots hit the floorboards within earshot, and no one said his name, not yet, but the weight of it sat there anyway, heavy and waiting. Ethan walked to the bar, rested his hand against the worn edge, and nodded. Once to Martha behind the counter, who had known him long enough not to ask questions she did not want answers to. But even she hesitated before setting down a glass, her fingers lingering just a second longer than usual, as if she might say something, and then deciding better of it. "Heard you been down by the river late," Hargrove said finally, not loud, not accusing, just enough to let the room know the silence had ended and the story had begun to speak for itself, and Ethan did not turn right away, did not give the man the satisfaction of a quick reaction. He just lifted the glass, took a slow drink, and set it back down with the same steady care he used for everything else. Because out here the way you moved mattered as much as what you said, and sometimes more. "River runs whether I am there or not," he replied, his voice even, and a few men shifted in their seats, not satisfied, not convinced, but not ready to push further either, because there was something in the way he said it that closed doors instead of opening them. And Hargrove gave a low hum like he was considering whether to keep going before deciding against it, for now. Outside, the sun had burned off most of the morning chill, but the air still carried that dry edge that came from weeks without rain, and Ethan could feel the town pressing in behind him as he stepped back onto the street. Not physically, not in any way a man could point to, but in the way attention gathered and followed, in the way stories built themselves out of half-glances and unfinished sentences, and he knew better than to try and outrun it, because you could not outrun something that lived in other people's heads. He walked past the blacksmith, past the hitching post, past the small church that rarely filled on Sundays, but somehow always had something to say about the rest of the week. And he kept his eyes forward, not because he was afraid to meet anyone's gaze, but because he understood that giving a story more shape only made it stronger, and this one was already growing without his help. By noon, the heat had settled in, pressing down across the flat stretch of land like a hand that did not intend to lift anytime soon, and Ethan found himself at the edge of town without remembering exactly how he had gotten there, the last building fading behind him as the open land took over, wide and quiet in a way that felt honest compared to the whispers he had left behind, and he stood there for a long moment, looking out toward the distant line of trees that marked the river's path, the same place where everything had shifted without warning, where a single moment had turned into something neither simple nor easy to walk away from. He reached into his pocket without thinking and felt the weight of the pendant resting there, heavier now than it had been in his hand, as if time itself had settled into it overnight, and he did not need to look at it to know what it was, or what it meant, only that it did not belong to him, and yet had not left him either, and that alone was enough to tell him this was not something that would fade the way most things did out here. A breeze moved across the land, light but steady, carrying with it the faint scent of water and something else beneath it, something harder to name, something that felt like memory before it had even happened, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a man takes when he realizes the road ahead has already been chosen for him, whether he steps forward or not. And somewhere beyond the trees, where the river bent and the current slowed, there was a girl who had looked at him like he was not a stranger at all, and that was the one thing he could not explain, not to the town, not to himself, and maybe not even to her. The river looked different in the afternoon light, not softer, not kinder, just more honest, the way things tend to be when the sun is high enough to strip away shadows and leave nothing but what is there, and Ethan Cole stood at the edge of it with his hat pushed back slightly, eyes scanning the slow bend where the water curved around a line of worn stones, the same place where he had seen her before, the same place that had not left his thoughts since. And for a long moment, there was nothing. Just the sound of current brushing against the bank and the dry whisper of wind moving through cottonwood leaves. But he stayed anyway, because something in him understood that leaving too soon would mean missing something he had already been pulled into without knowing how or why. He crouched near the edge, letting his fingers skim the surface just long enough to feel the cold pull of it, steady and certain, and he wondered, not for the first time, whether it had been chance that brought her there that night or something else entirely, something quieter, something that did not announce itself but still found its way to where it needed to be. And that was when he heard it, not a sound that belonged to the river or the wind, but something lighter, a shift of gravel behind him that carried intention instead of accident. And he did not turn right away, not out of fear, but out of a kind of respect for the moment, as if turning too quickly might break something fragile that had not yet decided whether to stay. "You came back," her voice said, and it held that same calm weight as before, not surprised, not questioning, just stating what already was. And Ethan straightened slowly, turning just enough to see her, without closing the space between them, because distance mattered here, not just in steps but in meaning, and she stood a few yards away, dry this time, her feet planted on the bank with the kind of stillness that made the world around her seem louder by comparison, and the light caught her face more clearly now, revealing lines of quiet strength rather than softness, eyes that did not look away but did not challenge either, simply held. "So did you," he replied, and there was no edge to it, no attempt to claim anything from the exchange, just a recognition that neither of them had walked away from what had started, and she tilted her head slightly, as if weighing the words not for what they said but for what they chose not to say, and then her gaze shifted, not to him but to his pocket, precise and knowing, and that was when he understood she had not come back for conversation. He reached into his coat without hesitation, slow enough to show intent, but not delay, and when he pulled the pendant free, it caught the sunlight in a way that made the turquoise glow deeper than it had before, like the color held something beneath its surface that only revealed itself when it chose to. And he held it out between them, palm open, offering it without stepping closer, because he knew enough now to understand that how something was given mattered just as much as the giving itself. She did not move right away, and the space between them seemed to stretch, not in distance but in weight, the kind that settles when two people stand on opposite sides of something neither fully understands yet both feel the shape of. And when she finally stepped forward, it was measured, deliberate, each foot placed as if the ground itself needed to agree with her before she moved, and she stopped just short of his reach, close enough now that he could see the fine details in the silver, wrapping around the stone, the way it had been shaped by hand, not for decoration but for purpose. "It did not fall," she said quietly, her eyes lifting from the pendant to meet his, and there was something firmer in her voice now, something that carried more than observation, and Ethan felt that same quiet shift inside him again, the sense that this was not a simple exchange, not something that could be undone by returning what had been taken. "Looked like it did," he answered, but the words felt thinner than he intended, like they did not hold up against whatever she already knew, and she shook her head once, not in disagreement but in correction, the kind that did not argue but replaced. "Things like this do not fall," she said, and her hand rose, not to take it yet, but to hover just above his palm, close enough that he could feel the faint warmth of it without contact. And for a moment neither of them moved, the air between them holding still as if waiting for something neither had said yet. And then she lowered her hand slightly, not touching the pendant, not touching him, just enough to make the meaning clear. "It chose," she finished, and the words settled between them with a weight that did not need explanation, because Ethan understood it in the same way he had understood the silence in town that morning. Not through reason, but through something deeper, something that did not ask permission before becoming real. And he closed his fingers slowly around the stone, not pulling it back, but not releasing it either, caught in that narrow space where choice had already been made before he knew it existed. And when he looked at her again, he saw it there, not in her expression but in the way she stood, steady and certain, like someone who had seen this before, or had been told about it long before it ever happened. And for the first time since that night, Ethan realized this was not about a meeting by the river, not about a man and a girl crossing paths where they should not have, but about something that had been set in motion long before either of them had stepped into it, something that did not belong to one world or the other, and would not leave either unchanged. The space between them did not close, even as the distance shortened to less than 3 feet, because some distances are not measured in steps, but in understanding, and Ethan Cole could feel it now. The invisible line that neither of them crossed without consequence, the kind that did not show itself until a man was already standing on it, unsure whether to move forward or step back. And the pendant resting in his hand felt heavier with each passing second, not in weight, but in meaning, like it carried something that had been waiting longer than either of them had known. The wind shifted slightly, brushing past them from the direction of the trees, carrying the scent of dry leaves and distant water, and Ayanna lowered her hand slowly, not taking the pendant, not reaching for it again, just letting it remain where it was, as if the act of holding back mattered more than the act of taking. And when she spoke, her voice was quieter than before, but steadier, like someone choosing each word with care rather than urgency. "There are rules," she said, and the words settled into the air without force, but with weight, the kind that did not need to be explained to be understood. And Ethan gave a slight nod, not because he knew what those rules were, but because he recognized the tone of someone who lived by them. "There always are," he answered, his voice even, and she studied him for a moment, not his face, not his stance, but something deeper, something that seemed to measure whether he was the kind of man who listened or the kind who only waited for his turn to speak, and whatever she found there did not make her turn away. "You broke one," she said, and there was no accusation in it. No edge of anger, just a statement placed carefully between them, like something fragile that could not be taken back once spoken, and Ethan felt the words settle into him in a way he could not ignore, because he knew it was true even without understanding how. "Did not know there was one to break," he replied, and for the first time, there was the slightest shift in her expression, not quite a smile, not quite approval, but something that acknowledged the difference between intention and action. "It does not matter," she said softly, her eyes moving briefly to the pendant still in his hand before returning to his face, and the silence that followed stretched longer than the ones before, not empty, but full, as if something was being decided without either of them speaking it aloud. The river moved steadily behind them, unchanged by any of it, water slipping past stone and sand with the same quiet persistence it had always carried, and Ethan became aware of how still everything else had grown, the wind holding its breath, the trees no longer shifting, the world narrowing down to the space between him and her and the small object that now connected them in a way neither had chosen. "If you keep it," she continued, her voice steady again, "you do not just carry it." She paused then, not for effect, but because the next words required it, and when she spoke again, they came slower, more deliberate, like each one had to be placed exactly where it belonged. "It carries you." Ethan let out a slow breath, not a sigh, not a sign of resistance, just the kind of breath a man takes when he realizes the ground beneath him has changed and will not return to what it was before, and he looked down at the pendant again, turning it slightly in his fingers, watching how the light moved across the stone, revealing lines and imperfections that had not been visible before, details that only showed themselves when you stopped looking for something simple and started seeing what was actually there. "And if I do not keep it?" he asked, lifting his gaze back to hers, and for the first time there was a question in his voice, not uncertainty, but a willingness to understand something beyond his own world, and Ayanna held his eyes without hesitation, her answer coming without pause. "Then you still carry what it chose," she said, and there was no softness in that truth, no way around it, just the quiet certainty of something that did not bend for comfort or convenience. And Ethan felt that settle deeper than anything she had said before, because it left him with no simple path, no clear way to step out of what had already begun. A distant sound drifted across the land then, faint but distinct, the rhythm of hooves somewhere beyond the trees, far enough not to be a threat, but close enough to remind them both that the world beyond this moment still existed, still moved forward whether they were ready or not. And Ayanna turned her head slightly toward the sound, her posture shifting just enough to show that she had heard it long before he had. And when she looked back at him, something in her gaze had changed, not in intensity, but in urgency, the kind that did not panic but did not wait either. "They will come," she said. And this time there was no ambiguity in her words, no room for interpretation, just a simple truth laid bare. And Ethan did not ask who she meant, because he already knew it was not just one side or the other, not just the people from the town or the ones from beyond it, but both, drawn by something neither would fully understand until it was too late to pretend it did not matter. He closed his fingers around the pendant once more, not tightening his grip, just holding it steady. And when he looked at her again, there was no hesitation left in his eyes, only the quiet acceptance of a man who understood that some things are decided the moment they begin, not when they end. And Ayanna gave the slightest nod, as if that was the answer she had been waiting for, not spoken, but seen, and without another word, she stepped back, one pace, then another, the distance between them growing again, not as something broken, but as something preserved. And within seconds she was already part of the landscape once more, her figure blending with the line of trees until she was no longer there at all, leaving Ethan alone by the river with the weight of something that had not asked for his consent, but had claimed him all the same. And for the first time since that night, he understood that this was not about what he had done, but about what he would choose not to undo. By the time Ethan Cole turned back toward Red Hollow, the sun had already begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the open land that stretched ahead of him. And every step he took felt different from the ones he had taken that morning, not heavier, not slower, just marked by something that had settled into place without asking. The kind of quiet shift a man notices only after it has already happened. And the pendant in his pocket seemed to move with him in a way that had nothing to do with motion, a steady presence that did not press but did not disappear either. The town came into view gradually, first the faint outline of rooftops against the horizon, then the sharper lines of wooden structures standing firm against the dry wind, and finally the familiar stretch of Main Street where life continued the way it always had, or at least the way it tried to. Because even from a distance Ethan could sense the difference, the subtle tightening of something beneath the surface, like the land itself had heard what had not been spoken aloud and was waiting to see what would come of it. As he stepped past the first building, he noticed the horses tied along the post before anything else, more of them than usual, saddles worn but well kept, reins looped with care, and there was a stillness to them that did not match the usual restless shifting of animals left waiting too long, as if they too were listening for something. And that was when he heard it, not loud, not urgent, but steady. Voices gathered in low conversation just beyond the saloon doors, not the usual laughter or idle talk, but something more focused, more deliberate. The kind that builds when men are trying to make sense of something they do not understand but feel they should. He slowed without stopping, letting his eyes move without drawing attention, and near the edge of the street stood Sheriff Brennan, his posture straighter than usual, hat pulled low but not enough to hide the tension in his jaw. And beside him were two men Ethan did not recognize, their clothes marked with dust from long miles, their stance easy but watchful, the kind that comes from living in places where awareness matters more than comfort. And neither of them spoke as Ethan passed, but their eyes followed him in a way that said they had already decided something about him without needing confirmation. The door to the saloon opened then, and Hargrove stepped out, slower than usual, his gaze moving between Ethan and the strangers with a quiet calculation that did not belong to idle curiosity. And for a brief moment, the entire street seemed to hold its breath again, the kind of pause that comes before something shifts, not in action, but in understanding. Ethan did not stop, did not turn. He kept walking as if the weight of their attention was nothing more than dust settling on his shoulders, because he knew better than to give it shape, knew that once a man acknowledges something like that, it grows teeth where there had only been whispers before, and yet even as he moved past, he could feel it building, not behind him, but around him, a circle forming without closing, waiting for the moment it would no longer need to pretend it was not there. He reached his cabin just outside the edge of town as the lights softened into that quiet gold that comes before evening takes hold, and the land around it lay still, untouched by the murmurs he had left behind, but not untouched by what followed him. Because silence does not mean absence, and Ethan understood that now more than ever. He stepped inside, the familiar creak of the wooden floor grounding him in something that had not changed, and for a moment he stood there, just listening, to the absence of voices, to the steady rhythm of his own breath, to the quiet that had once been enough, and now felt like it held something else within it, something waiting. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the pendant, setting it carefully on the table near the window where the last light of the day could touch it, and as it rested there, still and unassuming, it seemed almost ordinary again, just a piece of stone wrapped in silver, something that could be explained if a man chose not to look too closely. And yet Ethan knew better now, because some things do not need to change their appearance to change everything around them. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the distant sound of hooves once more, closer this time. Not rushing, not scattered, but measured, like those who rode understood exactly where they were going and did not need to hurry to get there. And Ethan did not move to the door, did not reach for anything. He simply stood where he was, eyes resting on the pendant as if it might offer an answer it had not yet given. And in that stillness, he understood something that settled deeper than anything before, that whatever had begun by the river had not stayed there. It had followed him, not as a burden, not as a mistake, but as something that had already started to draw lines across two worlds that were never meant to meet this way. And outside, as the last light slipped beneath the horizon, the quiet that settled over the land did not feel like peace, but like the moment before a truth reveals itself, not with force, but with a kind of clarity that leaves no room for turning away. Night settled slowly over the land, not with darkness all at once, but in layers, each one quieting something the last had left behind. And Ethan Cole remained where he was inside the cabin, the last trace of sunlight fading from the window until the pendant on the table no longer caught the light, but seemed to hold it instead, a faint, steady presence that did not disappear when the world around it dimmed. And he stood there longer than he needed to, not waiting for anything he could name, just listening, the way a man does when he senses that silence is not empty, but filled with something that has not yet shown itself. The sound came again, clearer now, hooves against dry ground, measured and even, not rushed, not uncertain. And Ethan did not move to greet it, did not step outside or reach for the door, because he understood that stepping into something too early can change what it becomes, and whatever was coming had already decided its own pace. The horses stopped somewhere just beyond the edge of his property, close enough that he could hear the soft shift of leather, the quiet exhale of animals coming to rest after a long ride. And then nothing, no voices, no calls, just that same stillness returning as if the land itself had chosen to hold its breath again. Ethan reached for the pendant without thinking, his fingers closing around the cool surface, and for a moment he considered leaving it where it was, letting it remain separate from whatever stood outside. But something in him resisted that, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because this was not something that stayed behind when a man stepped forward, and he slipped it back into his pocket just as the knock came. Not loud, not forceful, just two steady taps against the wooden frame, deliberate enough to carry meaning without urgency. He crossed the room in a few quiet steps and opened the door without hesitation, because hesitation out here speaks louder than any words a man might choose. And standing just beyond the threshold was a man he had never seen before, tall, composed, his presence calm in a way that did not ask for attention but held it anyway, his clothes marked by travel but worn with care, and behind him, a few yards back, stood two others, their figures still, their horses waiting without movement, as if they understood that whatever was being decided here did not belong to them yet. The man at the door met Ethan's gaze without challenge, without greeting, just a steady look that carried its own kind of introduction. And when he spoke, his voice was low, measured, each word placed with intention. "You found something that does not belong to you," he said, and there was no accusation in it, no raised tone, just a statement that had already been decided before it was spoken. And Ethan did not answer right away, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that answers given too quickly often reveal more than they intend. "Depends on what you mean by found," he replied after a moment, his voice even, matching the calm of the man before him, And the man's expression did not change, not in approval, not in disagreement, just a slight narrowing of focus, as if he were adjusting something unseen rather than reacting. "It came to you," the man said, and this time the words carried a subtle weight that did not need to be explained, and Ethan felt that same quiet recognition settle in again, the echo of what Ayana had said by the river, and he knew then that whatever this was, it was not confined to one voice or one place. It moved through both worlds with the same certainty. It did, Ethan admitted, not offering more than that, not stepping beyond the truth that had already been spoken, and the man gave a small nod, not satisfied, not finished, just acknowledging the first piece of something larger. "Then you understand," he continued, and for the first time there was the faintest shift in his tone, not pressure, not demand, but expectation, the kind that comes from knowing the path ahead even when the man walking it does not. Ethan held his gaze, steady and unyielding, not in defiance but in clarity, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the air between them holding still as if the next words mattered more than the ones that had already been said. "I understand enough," Ethan replied finally, and it was not a complete answer, not something that closed the space between them, but it was honest in a way that did not leave room for pretense, and the man seemed to consider that, not with visible thought, but with the kind that settles behind the eyes without movement. "That is where men make their choices," he said, and then, after a brief pause that carried more weight than the words themselves, he added, "What you do next will not stay with you alone." The sentence did not linger, did not press, it simply existed, and Ethan felt it land with a quiet certainty that matched everything else that had unfolded since the river, and he gave a slight nod, not in agreement, not in acceptance, but in acknowledgement of something that could not be undone. The man stepped back then, not turning, not breaking the line of sight until the distance between them had grown enough to release whatever held it in place, and without another word, he moved toward the others waiting by the horses, his steps steady, unhurried, as if nothing more needed to be said for now. Ethan remained in the doorway, watching as they mounted and rode off the same way they had come, their figures fading into the darkness without sound or spectacle, leaving behind only the faint imprint of their presence, and the knowledge that whatever had begun was no longer contained to quiet meetings by the river. And as the night settled fully around him, Ethan closed the door slowly, the wood meeting the frame with a soft, final sound that did not end anything, only marked the moment before. The next choice would have to be made. Morning did not bring relief. It only brought clarity, and clarity has a way of sharpening things a man might rather leave blurred, and Ethan Cole felt it the moment he stepped outside, the air cooler but tighter somehow, like the land itself had drawn a line overnight and was waiting to see who would cross it first, and the distant sound of town life carried differently now, not scattered and easy, but gathered, focused, as if every voice had found the same direction without needing to agree. Out loud, he saddled his horse without rushing, each movement deliberate, the leather creaking softly under his hands, and when he mounted, he did not head toward the river. Not yet. He rode toward town instead, because there are moments when a man understands that avoiding something only gives it more room to grow, and whatever had begun was no longer something that stayed hidden between trees and water. Red Hollow looked the same from a distance, the same buildings, the same stretch of dirt road, the same line of posts where horses waited, but as he drew closer, the difference became clear in the way people stood, not moving about their day, but holding their places, watching without pretending not to, and when Ethan rode in, the conversations did not stop this time. They shifted, turned, shaped themselves around him openly, because whatever uncertainty had been there before had settled into something more solid, something that no longer needed whispers to exist. Sheriff Brennan stood near the center of the street, not alone now, and the same too. Men from the night before were there beside him, their posture unchanged but their presence no longer quiet, and a few townsfolk had gathered nearby, not close enough to be part of the exchange, but not far enough to pretend they were not listening, and Ethan slowed his horse to a stop about 10 feet away, not stepping down, not closing the distance, because the space between them mattered more now than it had before. Brennan cleared his throat, his voice carrying a little more force than it usually did, not because he felt it, but because he needed to. "You have something that does not belong here," he said, and the words landed differently in daylight, heavier, shaped by the ears that heard them, and Ethan looked at him steadily, not challenging, not yielding, just present in a way that did not give anything away. "Depends on what you think belongs," Ethan replied, and there was a slight shift among the onlookers, a tightening of attention, the kind that comes when words start to carry more than their surface meaning. And one of the strangers stepped forward then, just half a pace, enough to claim the moment without taking it, his eyes steady on Ethan in the same way they had been the night before. "It is not about what we think," the man said, his voice calm, measured. "It is about what has already been set." The sentence settled into the space between them, not loud, not forceful, but certain, and Ethan felt again that same quiet understanding, the echo of something that had begun before any of them had spoken it aloud. Brennan shifted slightly, his hand resting near his belt, not in threat, but in habit, and his gaze moved briefly to the people behind him before returning to Ethan, as if reminding himself that he was not alone in this, that whatever he said next would not belong to him alone. "We need to know what happened by that river," he said, and this time there was no attempt to soften it, no way to pretend it was a simple question, and the air seemed to tighten around the words, waiting. Ethan sat still in the saddle, his posture relaxed but grounded, the kind that comes from knowing that movement at the wrong time can change everything. And for a moment he said nothing, not out of defiance, but because he understood that once something is spoken, it cannot be taken back, and what he carried now was not just his to give away. The wind moved lightly through the street, lifting dust in small swirls that caught the sunlight before settling again, and Ethan glanced briefly toward the edge of town, toward the distant line of trees that marked the river, not because he expected to see anything there, but because part of him knew that whatever choice he made now would reach that place whether he intended it to or not. "Nothing happened that needs telling," he said finally, his voice even, and the words did not rise, did not push, they simply existed, and that was enough to shift the moment. A murmur moved through the small crowd, not loud, but present, and Brennan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in the strain of holding something together that was beginning to pull in different directions. "That is not how this works," Brennan said, quieter now, more to himself than to Ethan, but the stranger beside him did not look away, did not shift, he simply watched, as if this was the moment he had been waiting for all along. "It is exactly how it works," Ethan answered, and for the first time there was a trace of something beneath his calm, not defiance, not pride, but conviction, the kind that does not ask for agreement, and the silence that followed was different from the others, not uncertain, not waiting, but settled, like something had been placed where it would not move. The stranger gave a slight nod then, not to Ethan, not to Brennan, but to the moment itself, as if acknowledging that a line had been drawn without needing to see where it would lead, and Brennan exhaled slowly, the weight of the town pressing into his shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with the badge he wore. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," he said, and Ethan held his gaze, steady, unbroken. "It was never going to be easy," he replied, and somewhere in that exchange, something shifted again, not in action, not in movement, but in understanding, because both sides now knew that whatever truth lay beneath this, it was not one that would be spoken simply, and as the sun climbed higher, casting sharper light across the street, the space between them remained, not closed, not broken, just held, waiting for what would come next. No one moved right away, and that was what made the moment heavier than any raised voice could have, because stillness in a place like Red Hollow did not come from peace. It came from something waiting to decide what it would become, and Ethan Cole remained in the saddle, his posture unchanged, his hands resting easy but not loose, the kind of stillness that did not invite challenge but did not avoid it either. And across from him Sheriff Brennan shifted his weight slightly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, caught between the expectations behind him and the quiet certainty standing in front of him. The stranger beside Brennan watched it all without interruption, his gaze steady, not searching for weakness, not pushing for reaction, just observing in a way that suggested he had seen moments like this before, moments where words no longer carried the weight, and something else had to take their place, something quieter, something harder to argue against. A breeze passed through the street, lifting dust in thin lines that curled and disappeared as quickly as they formed. And somewhere in the distance a door creaked open and then closed again, the sound small but clear, a reminder that life did not stop for a single moment, no matter how much it tried to hold itself still. Brennan exhaled slowly, his eyes flicking once more to the gathered townsfolk before settling back on Ethan. And when he spoke again, his voice had lost the edge it had carried before, not softer, but more deliberate, like a man choosing his footing carefully on uncertain ground. If you are protecting something, he said, then you need to understand what that brings with it. And the words hung there, not a warning, not quite, but close enough to feel like one, and Ethan met his gaze without hesitation, because he understood now that this was not about convincing anyone, not about explaining something that could not be explained without breaking it, but about holding a line that had already been drawn. I understand enough, he said again, and the repetition did not weaken the statement, it strengthened it, because it showed that nothing had shifted, nothing had been shaken loose by pressure or presence, and that alone changed the balance of the moment in a way no one spoke about, but everyone felt. The stranger gave another slight nod, almost imperceptible, and then his attention moved, not to Ethan, not to Brennan, but to the space between them, as if acknowledging something that had settled there beyond the reach of either side. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried that same calm certainty it always had. There are truths that do not belong to those who witness them, he said, and the sentence did not demand agreement. It simply existed, and the way it settled into the air made it clear that it did not need to be defended. Brennan glanced at him briefly, then back at Ethan, and for a moment something passed through his expression that had not been there before, not doubt, not quite, but something closer to understanding, the kind that comes when a man realizes the situation in front of him is not one he can solve with the tools he has always relied on. And what about the rest of us? Brennan asked, quieter now, less like a sheriff and more like a man trying to make sense of something larger than himself. The ones who are left with questions. And Ethan held his gaze, steady, unbroken, and for a long second he did not answer, because the truth of it was simple and difficult at the same time, and not something that could be softened without losing its meaning. Then you keep them, he said, and the words did not push, did not challenge, they simply placed the weight where it belonged, and a murmur moved through the small crowd again, not louder, not sharper, just present, like a ripple across still water that did not break the surface but changed it all the same. The stranger's eyes rested on Ethan a moment longer, and there was something there now that had not been before, not approval, not agreement, but recognition, the kind that does not come from shared belief, but from shared understanding, and he inclined his head slightly, a gesture so small it could have been missed if anyone had been looking for something larger. Brennan straightened then, the shift subtle but real, and whatever tension had held his shoulders tight seemed to ease, not disappear, but settle into something he could carry, without it breaking him, and he gave a slow nod, not to Ethan, not to the stranger, but to the moment itself, as if accepting that not every story in his town would end with a clear answer. That is all then, he said, and there was no finality in it, no sense of closure, just an acknowledgement that nothing more could be taken from this without forcing something that did not belong to him to give. Ethan did not respond, did not move. He simply remained where he was for a moment longer, letting the weight of what had just passed settle into place. And then, without hurry, he turned his horse, not away in retreat, but in quiet continuation, as if the path ahead had already been chosen and did not need to be announced. The street slowly began to move again behind him, voices returning in low tones, not the same as before, not filled with certainty, but not searching for it either. And as Ethan rode out of Red Hollow, the sun high above casting clear light across the land, he understood something that did not need to be spoken, that the truth he carried was not meant to be shared in words, not because it was hidden, but because it belonged somewhere beyond what either side could claim, and that was enough. Years passed the way they always do out on the open land, not marked by dates or calendars, but by the slow turning of seasons, by fences repaired and weather endured, by the quiet understanding that time does not announce itself when it changes a man. It simply does it and leaves him to notice afterward. And Ethan Cole remained where he had always been, on the edge of Red Hollow, but never fully inside it, his days shaped by the same work, the same routines, yet carrying something beneath them that had not been there before, something that did not fade with distance or dull with repetition. The town moved on in its own way, as towns do, new faces replacing old ones, stories rising and falling like dust on the wind. But there was one story that never quite settled, one that returned in different forms depending on who told it, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as a quiet curiosity, sometimes as something closer to respect than anyone cared to admit. And it always circled back to the same moment, a man by the river, a girl no one could fully describe, and a silence that followed where answers should have been. Some said he had lost something that night, something no one could see but everyone could sense in the way he carried himself afterward, not broken, not changed in any obvious way, but marked, the way a trail is marked after something passes through it and leaves no footprints behind. And others said he had gained something instead, something that made him step a little slower when the wind shifted, something that made him look toward the river even when he had no reason to go there, as if part of him remained tied to a place that no longer called his name out loud. He never spoke of it, not to the men who still tried from time to time to draw it out of him, not to the newcomers who had only heard pieces and thought they might piece together the rest, not even to himself in any way that could be put into words, because some truths do not become clearer when spoken. They only lose the shape that made them real in the first place, and Ethan understood that in a way that did not need explanation. The pendant never left him, though no one saw it, not because he hid it with care, but because it did not ask to be shown. It remained where it belonged, close enough to be felt, quiet enough to be forgotten by anyone who did not already know to look for it. And over time it became less an object and more a presence, something that did not remind him of the past but stayed with him in the present, steady and unchanged by the years that moved around it. The river remained as it had always been, shifting and constant at the same time, and Ethan returned to it now and then, not often, not with purpose that could be explained, just enough to stand where the current slowed and listen to the water move, the same sound it had made the first time, the same sound it would make long after he was gone, and each time he went, he did not expect to see her, did not look for signs or shadows or anything that could be mistaken for hope, because whatever had happened there had not been something meant to repeat, it had been something meant to remain as it was, complete in its own quiet way. There were those who claimed they had seen her, years later, near the far edge of the trees where the land rose slightly before fading into distance, a figure standing still for just a moment before disappearing again. But those stories never lasted long, not because they were untrue, but because they did not need to be proven, and no one who spoke them ever did so with certainty, only with the kind of tone that suggests something seen without needing to be believed. As for Ethan, he grew older the same way the land did, without asking for attention, without marking the passing of time in anything but the way he moved and the way he paused. And those who watched him long enough began to understand something that had nothing to do with the story itself, something quieter, something deeper, that whatever had been asked of him that day in the street, whatever line had been drawn and held without words, it had not been about choosing a side or proving a point. It had been about knowing when not to take something that was not meant to be his to give, and that was a kind of strength the town did not often speak about, but could not ignore. And so the story remained, not finished, not explained, just carried forward in the spaces between what was said and what was left unsaid, told in fragments and glances and quiet pauses, until it became something larger than the moment that created it, something that belonged not to Ethan, not to the girl by the river, not to the town that tried to understand it, but to the silence that held it all together, and out there, where the river bends and the current softens just enough to reflect the sky, the wind still moves the same way it always has, carrying nothing and everything at once, leaving behind only the feeling that some truths do not need to be spoken to be remembered, and that sometimes the quietest choices are the ones that last the longest.